I'm Francis Dearnley, and this is Ukraine, the latest. Today, as President Zelensky heads to Washington for another high-stakes meeting with Donald Trump, we break down the latest from the front lines as NATO vows to ramp up its military support for Ukraine. We also examine a rare protest in St Petersburg calling for Vladimir Putin's death, explore how recent drone incursions are reshaping German attitudes towards the war, and ask why Syria's president, once a sworn enemy of the Kremlin, has now met the Russian president in Moscow.
Bravery takes you through the most unimaginable hardships to finally reward you with victory.
Russia does not want peace.
Erstens, wir verteidigen mit unserer Hilfe für die Ukraine auch unsere Freiheit und unsere europäischen Werte.
If I'm president, I will have that war settled in one day, 24 hours.
We are with you, not just today or tomorrow, but for 100 years.
Nous ne pouvons pas, comme Européens, laisser gagner la Russie en Ukraine.
Nobody's going to break us. We're strong. We're Ukrainians.
It's Thursday, the 16th of October, 3 years and 236 days since the full-scale invasion began. And today, I'm joined by my fellow journalists at The Telegraph, Adélie Pojzman-Pontay, and in Germany, our Berlin correspondent, James Rothwell. But first, over to the battlefield. Two sectors remain the most active. Starting in the northeast in Kharkiv, according to the ISW and others, Russian forces advanced in western Vovchansk, northeast of Kharkiv city. But the most intense fighting is about 80 kilometres south of there in Kupiansk. So much so that the oblast authorities have expanded the mandatory evacuation zone for families with children in that district. It compels the evacuation of families from 40 settlements. About 601 children from 409 families are to be relocated. It speaks to the deteriorating situation around Kharkiv, hence why more people are being displaced, as you'll have heard from Ada Wordsworth of the charity HARP on the 29th of September. Thank you, by the way, to everybody who donated to that fundraiser. They've now reached their target of £10,000 in David's memory, and we'll have her back on very soon to talk more about that. There are reports of an unidentified object going into the reservoir just north of Kharkiv city, which could, officials fear, pose a threat to the water supply. I just thought I would mention that. We don't know any more information at this stage. Now, the commander of a Ukrainian drone regiment operating in the Kupiansk direction said yesterday Russian forces continue attempts to cross the Oskil River and are striking bridges across the river with artillery and drones while employing shoot and scoot artillery tactics to avoid drone surveillance. The regimental commander stated Russian forces shifted tactics to exploit foliage and swampy terrain near the river during crossing attempts after the Ukrainians defeated their attempts to infiltrate northern Kupiansk through a gas pipe in early September, as we reported at the time. Now, Pokrovsk down in Donetsk is another key sector of activity. There have been some minor Russian gains amid their increased offensive there recently. The Russian Ministry of Defense claims their troops have actually seized the entirety of Novopavlivka, but that is contested. The ISW assesses a flag raised there in the centre was likely just an infiltration mission. To give you a sense of the nature of the fighting, a deputy commander of a Ukrainian battalion operating in Pokrovsk claimed Russian forces are increasingly integrating mechanized assaults with infantry assaults in this direction. Some of Russia's best drone operators are operating there, as previously discussed. The brigade assessed the kill zone will only expand in the coming months. I should add there are rumours swirling this morning of a large Russian armoured assault taking place as we speak towards Minohrad, east of the city, which is not going according to plan, with very high casualties. More on that tomorrow if we get more information. Turning to the air war, Ukraine's attacks on Russia's energy infrastructure continues unabated. A drone struck an industrial area in the Russian city of Ufa, about 1,400 kilometres from the front line, where one of Bashkortostan's largest oil refineries is located. Local residents reported seeing smoke near the city's industrial zone and experiencing disruptions to mobile internet service. If confirmed, that incident would mark the third Ukrainian drone strike in that region in the past month. So again, another area we need to be continuing to look at. Elsewhere, a drone attack was also reported in Volgograd overnight, according to local Telegram channels. Residents claimed that an oil refinery was struck there too. Likewise, more information is bleeding through of the damage done to the facility in Crimea, hit earlier this week. One that sparked a fire so huge it was visible from 25 kilometres away. According to Kyiv's General Staff, 16 fuel tanks were damaged. In case you missed it and want an overview of the Ukrainian strategy in those bombardments, I highly recommend last Monday's episode with Michael Bonnet of the Rand Corporation in the US. After our episode, he wrote a piece for the Wall Street Journal, which we'll link to in the show notes, featuring historic examples of why attacking oil infrastructure can be decisive in military campaigns, just as it was in both Europe and the Pacific during World War II. As he concludes, the consequences for Russia will grow, and Putin could be forced to choose war materials production or the commerce demands of Russia's oligarchs. Without reliable resupplies, the Russian military will become less mobile and create opportunities for incremental Ukrainian victories. The Russian bear is slowly being starved. In response, Moscow's aerial campaign continues to target Ukraine's energy and heat infrastructure as the weather begins to turn colder. Last night, Russia launched 26 Iskander ballistic missiles, 2 Kinzhal and 2 cruise missiles, 7 glide bombs and 320 Shahed drones. Most were shot down, though hits were recorded in 14 locations, mainly in the Poltava and Kharkiv regions. Attacks are still ongoing, and the last reports we had were some strikes hitting at around 6 o'clock this morning. President Zelensky responded by saying this: "Last night brought strikes against our people, our energy sector and our civilian infrastructure. There is confirmation the Russians are using double terror, attacking with Shaheds, carrying cluster munitions and launching repeated strikes to injure firefighters and energy workers who are restoring damaged facilities. Putin has turned a deaf ear to everything the world says, so the only language that can still get through to him is the language of pressure. Now there is an important momentum towards peace in the Middle East. That is exactly what I will be discussing today and tomorrow in Washington." Adélie will be covering Zelensky's trip to the US in just a moment, but an indication of the tone shift may be found at the NATO meeting yesterday. Pete Hegseth, Washington's newly dubbed Secretary of War, is markedly using different language than he delivered a few months ago. He said, "If there is no path to peace in the short term, then the United States, along with our allies, will take steps necessary to impose costs on Russia for its continued aggression." Mark Rutte, NATO's Secretary-General, of course, added, "NATO will implement a number of additional counter-drone measures that will accelerate our ability to counter drones. We don't engage in tit-for-tat exchanges, but we can and do take necessary steps to defend and protect our own, to increase costs on those who might test us and to make clear to any potential adversary that our resolve is unshakable." Then, crucially, he added this: 6 allies are funding the first Pearl packages, and today we heard from ally after ally about new contributions. More than half of NATO allies have now signed up, securing this crucial flow of support for Ukraine. Now, just as a reminder, Pearl is the new prioritised Ukrainian requirements list. Yesterday, Finland confirmed it would join that initiative, and Lithuania said it would allocate $30 million to the pot on top of $104 million from the Netherlands. The Norwegian Ministry of Defence said it would allocate $6.8 billion of its 2026 national budget for its military aid to Ukraine. Germany, too, has said it will provide Kyiv with an additional military aid package worth more than $2.3 billion, including advanced air defence systems, precision-guided weapons and ammunition. So some positive signs out of NATO. But just to bring this section to a close, as I mentioned, Dom is among the spooks this morning at MI5 to hear from its Director General. He's just sent across a few quotes for me to read on air relevant to the war that he's heard straight from the horse's mouth, as it were. Quote, "Putin's grim attempt to subjugate Ukraine is well into its 4th year, but the sweeping triumph once imagined in the corridors of the Kremlin is no closer. Part of Putin's failure is due to the defiant spirit of the Ukrainian people. On my office wall hangs a plaque from counterparts in Kyiv which says, Victorious allies won because they fought not against enemies, but for their values and freedoms. Those of us contending with Russian sabotage and intimidation tactics further awestruck are actively learning from Ukrainian resilience in the face of a sustained aggression both overtly and covertly. In the last year, we and the police have disrupted a steady stream of surveillance plots with hostile intent, aimed at individuals Russian leaders perceive as their enemies. MI5 also spoke about Russia using proxies to attack Western interests. Quote, "You can see why Russia is resorting to this tactic. Many hundreds of Russian spies were expelled from their embassies across Europe. So the Russian intelligence services are picking up what they can online, recruiting proxies on social media platforms, instructing them via encrypted apps, and offering payment in cryptocurrencies. If you are a proxy, you're disposable. You may well be ghosted on payday. When you're caught, you'll be abandoned. You won't feature in a prisoner exchange. You're on your own." He ended by saying this: "With our partners across Europe, MI5 will keep detecting those who take orders from Russian thugs, and we will keep following trails back to those giving the orders, who imagine they're anonymous and unfindable behind their screens. They're not." So, it's a pretty bizarre day for Dom, it has to be said. He's starting with a chinwag with the head of MI5 and finishing naked in a sauna with the ambassador of Finland as he's inducted into the London Diplomatic Sauna Society. Apologies for leaving you with that rather appalling image. Let's go now to Adélie as we leave the military realm and enter the more overtly political. Adélie, can we start with Zelensky's visit to Washington? Quite a big day tomorrow.
Quite a big day indeed. Zelensky will be very obviously, as we've discussed many times on this podcast, pushing for military support. He's expected to press Trump for long-range Tomahawk missiles that would put Moscow and other major Russian cities within range of missile fire from Ukraine. And that is especially true now that the US is providing Ukraine with intelligence for these strikes. Trump has said that he could supply the weapons to Ukraine if Putin fails to come to the negotiating table. And he also said that he was looking at other options for supporting Ukraine besides Tomahawks without specifying what. They will undoubtedly discuss what could be included in the mega deal that President Trump floated last month in order for Ukraine to procure $90 billion of US weapons, and that's including the Tomahawk missiles. Part of the agreement could be that Ukraine would share drone technology with the United States. Despite Trump's shifting stance on Ukraine since he came into office, he has not committed so far to new arms supplies to Ukraine, instead relying on the Pearl Initiative, as Francis just mentioned, that several European countries have contributed to so far. Trump said yesterday that him and Zelensky would be discussing Ukraine's desire to go offensive, which would be a major shift on the front line, but that he would be the one making a determination on that and whether this would go ahead. He also cast doubt on Russia's military strength, with some pointed comments directed at Vladimir Putin. Trump urged Russia to make a peace deal and said that the dragged-out conflict was bad for Moscow's image as a great power. I quote, "It's a war that he should have won in 1 week, and that is now going into his 4th year. That does not make this big so-called war machine look good, but he could make a settlement. We're willing to settle, and I thought we had a deal." Ahead of Zelensky's visit, Treasury Secretary of the United States will be talking to his European counterparts on establishing a Ukraine Victory Fund, which will be bankrolled by the fresh tariffs on China. President Trump has coined these fresh tariffs and this fund as either Russian oil tariff on China or Ukrainian victory tariff, which is indeed a sign of the tone shift from Washington. Beijing has been labelled as a decisive enabler of Russia's war by NATO nations, but European powers so far have refused to go as far as calling it an enemy. The plan would introduce a 500% levy on imports from China, with the money generated being used on weapons for Ukraine's military. The plan is designed to put maximum economic pressure on Putin, whose war machine is reliant on Chinese support, to come to the negotiating table. The idea of sanctioning China over its purchases of Russian oil had previously faced roadblocks from European governments. Ukrainian and European counterparts would have to join for the fund to be implemented, and that is a big if. Denis Shmyhal, Ukraine's defense minister, told allies yesterday in Brussels that Ukraine would need another $120 billion to found another year of armed resistance in 2026. Now, staying on the topic of tariffs and of oil, Trump criticized India for continuing to buy Russian oil, saying yesterday that he was not happy and that Indian President Modi had assured him that they would not be buying any more oil from Russia and that they would only go back to Russia after the war is over. Trump has said he considered it a big step, but he wanted China to do the same thing as well. As we've covered over the last few weeks, Washington has imposed 50% tariffs on India for continuing to import Russian oil, with India repeatedly saying that they would not stop their imports. India is one of the major buyers of Russian fuel. Between December 2022 and until the end of June 2025, the country accounted for 38% of Russian crude exports and 19% of Russia's coal exports. Trump did not provide a timeline for when India would supposedly cease importing from Russia, but just this morning, Reuters reported that Indian refiners were indeed preparing to cut Russian oil imports and expected a gradual reduction. I'm going to continue a bit longer on the topic of oil and economic pressure on Russia, because yesterday the UK imposed its strongest sanctions on Russia yet, blacklisting 5 individuals and 35 companies, including oil giants Rosneft and Lukoil, as part of the package targeting 90 new entities and vessels. Rosneft alone accounts for nearly half of Russia's oil production and 6% of its global output. The oil and gas industry generated $130 billion in tax for the Kremlin in 2024, which is about a third of its total revenue, covering 83% of military expenditures. So it's a massive, massive input of money and in funding the war against Ukraine. The measures also target foreign companies that facilitate Russian oil exports, including India's Nayara Energy, in which Rosneft holds the largest share, and China's national pipeline group Beihai liquefied natural gas. That also targets 3 companies based in the United Arab Emirates and some tankers. The sanctions include asset freezes and restrictions on trust and transport services, extended the reach of previous UK and EU measures targeting Russia's energy sector. To move away from economic measures and sanctions, let's focus a little bit on Russia, because yesterday we talked about how the FSB had charged Russian dissidents from the Russian Anti-War Committee on terrorism. Well, it's not the only sign of public dissent in Russian society, because earlier this week, hundreds of young people gathered in St Petersburg were singing about overthrowing Putin. It's a rare moment of public dissent, of which we have not seen a lot over the last 3.5 years of war. The crowd joined street musicians in the central square on Tuesday night, and they were singing anti-war lyrics that have been called extremist under Russian censorship law. The song they were singing is called Cooperative Swan Lake by a pro-Ukrainian rapper called Noise MC. And it's become an unofficial anthem to the anger felt by young liberal Russians towards Putin's regime. Now, Cooperative Swan Lake, that's an intriguing title for a rap song, so let me break it down to you. Swan Lake has become an unexpected symbol of political upheaval in the light years of the Soviet Union, because it was broadcast on state TV on a loop following the death of Russian leaders, and also after a failed political coup in 1991, which ushered the collapse of the USSR. The song title is also a reference to Lake Cooperative in northwest Russia, where members of Putin's inner circle travel for the holidays. The song refers to Putin directly and says, "Let the old man shake in fear for his lake." Now, Noise MC is a 40-year-old musician whose real name is Ivan Alexeyev. He fled to Lithuania soon after Russia's invasion of Ukraine in 2022, and he has long condemned the apathy in Russian society towards the war in Ukraine and the annexation of Crimea in 2014. Moscow has since declared him a foreign agent, a legal designation that has been used aggressively in the wake of the war to punish critics of the Kremlin. There have been reports of similar public gatherings this summer, also in St Petersburg, also singing a variety of songs, maybe a playlist of songs by Noise MC. And, I don't speak Russian, but I would quite like to listen to those and see what they're all about. His music has been banned from Russian platforms, with millions of Russians still listening to it in bars, stream cover versions online, or using VPNs to access it on YouTube. So it's very reminiscent of the ban on culture and music and rock music during Soviet times. Final story for me, Francis. Ukraine's military intelligence has carried out a cyber attack against Orion Telecom, one of the largest internet providers in Siberia, leading to approximately $800,000 in damages, as well as a leak of users' personal data. The cyber attack was reportedly carried out on June 12, which is Russia Day, when Orion Telecom's infrastructure were temporarily paralyzed. Orion Telecom is the sole internet operator and provider in at least one of the closed cities, specializing in uranium extraction in Russia. And the city lost connection entirely. So we'll have to watch out for any more reports on that. And that's it for me, Francis, for the rest of the diplomatic updates.
Well, thanks very much, Adélie. Well, let's leap over to Germany now and our Berlin correspondent, James Rothwell. James, guten Tag, mein Freund, willkommen. It's been a bad few weeks for former Chancellor Angela Merkel. As we reported, she's been, lambasted for remarks which seem to suggest certain European countries somehow antagonise Russia to invade Ukraine, and has been criticised for taking her book tour to Hungary amid everything going on in Brussels at the moment. But there have been more revelations in recent days. Can you bring us up to date on the latest, James?
Hello, Francis. Great to hear from you. First of all, congratulations to Dom for joining the Diplomatic Sauna Society. I am myself a member here in Berlin, so I look forward to hearing how that goes.
Is this some kind of secret society, James, that we should know about? I hadn't even heard of it before Dom was talking about it.
Oh, yeah, no, it's wonderful. It's like a sort of pro-Ukrainian Freemasons with more nudity. I highly recommend it. The Finns are really doing their bit for positive PR of Finnish culture on that front.
Is there a women's society, James?
Yeah, there is. At the Berlin embassy, there's two, actually. It's been a really bad month for Angela Merkel. One is even starting to get the impression that her legacy when it comes to foreign policy is actually beginning to fall apart, Francis. You alluded to those incredibly tone-deaf remarks that she made in an interview with a Hungarian newspaper recently, essentially blaming Poland and the Baltic states partially for the Russian invasion of Ukraine. Now, hot on the heels of that, a new investigative book called The Failure has come out in Germany, which alleges that the Merkel government was actually trying to train Russian troops at a series of state-of-the-art military facilities right up until Russian forces invaded Crimea. This was part of, according to that book, The Failure, an €870 million deal that would have led to German troops training their Russian counterparts at 8 military complexes in Russia with some very impressive, we're told, state-of-the-art military equipment. Now, of course, the deal never actually went through because of Russia's illegal invasion of Crimea. But the story is fascinating because it gives such a, I suppose you could say, quite alarming insight into what the German attitude towards Russia was under the Merkel government. And I just want to read out for you a quote that comes from Germany's Thomas de Maizière, then Defense Minister of Germany, said in 2011, "We have a security policy interest in a modern, well-led Russian army." That apparently is how the German government was justifying this thwarted plan to train Russian soldiers at the time. Of course, hearing those words coming from a German minister now, it just seems absolutely astonishing. It was, of course, over 10 years ago. But the reason that story is causing so much noise, Francis, over here and indeed in the rest of Europe is because it's really, really riling up the Baltic states and Poland. You know, these are the countries who are now sort of screaming, basically, "We told you so." These are the countries that for many, many years, as they tell it, were trying to warn Germany that this was a, completely nefarious state from their perspective to be getting into bed with, not a state that you would want to, really have any warm relations with, let alone train their soldiers. And of course, the wider background of this, Francis, is that Russia had just done really badly in the war with Georgia. So it was this sort of situation where the Germans had seen the Russian army perform really badly, and their kind of response to that was, well, let's help the Russians improve their military. Let's get it back into shape, a sort of policy that was only abandoned then after Crimea happened. And so it's just so frustrating from the perspective of the Central European states, the Baltic states, and perhaps they're now starting to feel vindicated. Perhaps books like The Failure, which is the source of this story, and the furor over Mrs. Merkel's comments about Poland basically being to blame for the Russian invasion a few weeks ago, perhaps all of that is leading to those countries feeling vindicated.
Fascinating. Well, thank you very much, James, for talking us through that. It does seem that every time she interjects on an issue, it is causing controversy. And I can't think of any European leader whose legacy, as you say, is being questioned as intensely as Frau Merkel's at the moment. Extraordinary times when she was, as I've said before, the woman of Europe. I mean, she was such a highly respected figure during her chancellorship, and yet now so much of her reputation is being questioned from all angles, really. But let's bring in a different subject now, and this is a row, James, that's broken out about bringing back military service. It's leading to quite a few splits in the German government.
Yes, that's right, Francis. So the German government is trying to bring back some kind of military service model. And because they're a coalition government, you've got a coalition led by Friedrich Merz, the centre-right chancellor, alongside the centre-left Social Democrats. Inevitably, this is a government that's starting to get into some pretty big rows over what its policies should look like. And military service is no exception to that. The military service model that we thought was going to be agreed upon this week and then announced in great detail at a celebratory press conference seems to have basically fallen apart. That was going to be a sort of multi-stage military service model that would begin with completely voluntary service. So stage one was basically a survey goes out, men have to fill it in, but that's where it ends in terms of the compulsory stuff. If you want to join the army, you join the army would love to have you, but you don't have to do it. Then, if that didn't manage to recruit enough soldiers for the German military, there'd be a second stage, putting a bit more pressure, basically, on young people to get involved, potentially including compulsory medical screening in order to give the German authorities a kind of live picture of the health and physical suitability of young Germans for war. And then there was going to be a third and fourth stage, sort of escalating in terms of how intensive the military service would be, with the final stage essentially being full-scale conscription. That, of course, probably reserved for a sort of crisis or war scenario. We were all led to believe, basically, that that was what the model was going to be, and it was going to be announced at a press conference this week. The press conference never happened, and we're now learning from reports in German media that the press conference hasn't happened because there's actually a stinking row in the coalition about how that bill should be written. Friedrich Merz, the CDU, the centre-right in the coalition, they want to see compulsory elements to the new military service model for Germany. They think if there aren't compulsory elements, if you don't have the potential for conscription, then there's no point in passing the bill, because from their perspective is that Germany urgently needs new soldiers in order to transform the Bundeswehr into what Friedrich Merz has said must be the strongest conventional military in Europe. So they want to see compulsory conscription-like aspects to this bill. But in the other corner, the centre-left Social Democrats, who are the other partner of this coalition, they're really, really uncomfortable about the idea of compulsory military service. That's partly historical, obviously, because of Germany's World War II past, but it's also, I think, being driven by this deep-seated antipathy in Germany, particularly among young people, towards having to join an army. Young Germans, anecdotally, would like to do a form of national service. So that might, for example, be driving an ambulance or taking part in some other kind of frontline services scheme. But there seems to be a lot of political controversy in the SPD's base about actually picking up a weapon and training as a soldier. There's this deeply entrenched cultural idea in post-war Germany that it is not a country which should be shooting guns, marching up and down parade squares and being in the military. That, of course, goes all the way back to the rise of Nazism. And so what we're looking at here, Francis, is on the surface of things, a sort of big noisy row about a military service bill. But like many issues in Germany on defence, it actually cuts right to the heart of what the German identity is and whether the Germans want to be, as Friedrich Merz, the Chancellor, wants them to become, a sort of more basically bellicose nation, or whether they need to stick on the path that they've been on all the way through the second half of the 20th century, which is being highly averse to the military, basically. Just one final piece of context here, which I think is really important when we discuss German military service. The Germans used to have it, but they got rid of it because it was unbelievably unpopular and Germans didn't want to do it. And that, of course, is a very, very important thing to consider if, as Friedrich Merz wants to do, apparently, you're trying to bring back a conscription model.
Well, thank you very much, James, for talking us through that complex issue, which, as you say, speaks to so many cultural and historic trends as well as just the present moment. But to bring us into the moment, of course, there have been these reports recently, which we've talked about, of drones flying over German airports. There are suggestions that there might be Russian involvement in that, not definitively proven, of course. Munich was one of the airports that was shut down about a week and a half ago. I just wanted to ask you, James, before we move on, what has the reaction been in Germany to those drone incursions, however we want to articulate it? Has it led to a slight shift in anxiety about the threat posed by Russia, or is it not really perhaps getting the same airtime that one might expect?
That's a great question. We can divide the drone incursions that happened into Germany into basically two groups. There was a whole raft of drone incursions in northwestern Germany, and that was drones flying over critical infrastructure, factories, and military bases. And then a bit later on, we saw some other drone incursions over Munich airport. I want to focus on the incursions at Munich airport because they were way more disruptive and public and attention grabbing than the northwestern drone incursions. Why? Well, obviously it's because Munich airport is a big, busy, important transit hub in Germany, and it happened in the middle of Oktoberfest, right? Or right at the end of Oktoberfest, I should say. And so you've got all of these Germans who've gathered in Munich for, a big old glass of beer and a pretzel, stranded at the airport as a result of the drone incursions. This caused a big stink in Germany. I mean, the German newspapers the next day were full of pictures showing these sort of camp beds which had been set up in the airport to accommodate Germans, probably quite hungover Germans, returning from Oktoberfest and getting trapped and having to sleep on a camper bag or a sleeping bag in the airport because some drone has plunged the entire airport into turmoil. It's really, really, really disruptive to fly drones over German airports, in particular because of the nighttime flight ban, which means if you get a drone in the air, whether you're a Russian saboteur or just a prankster, at around, let's say 9, 10, 11 o'clock, and you shut down the airport, you are basically cancelling a load of flights that can't run again until the following morning. And then everyone's got to find themselves a hotel, or they've got to sleep on a camper bed at Munich airport. So that particular drone incursion was immensely disruptive to, if you like, the cultural fabric of German life. And it feels like, and indeed some in the German government suspect that this was the rationale, it felt like it was a bit targeted, that they knew, whoever launched this attack, that because Munich airport would have tons of people transiting through it, because of Oktoberfest, they could cause maximum annoyance and disruption. Now, was it actually carried out by the Russians, and has there been a huge sort of kinetic reaction in Germany to that? Well, yes, to some extent. The Germans are now looking at changing their rules of engagement so that German soldiers in the Bundeswehr will be allowed to shoot down drones. That's part of their response to this. There's also some skepticism, though, in some quarters of the German media about whether we're really sure that this was Russian hybrid warfare. It's been speculated, for example, that it may have been pranksters. It's also been speculated that it might just be far-left activists who have also claimed responsibility for some other recent incidents in Germany, like train sabotage, which on the surface of it might look like Russian sabotage. Some security analysts would, of course, make the argument that Russia uses proxies to do all of these hybrid attacks, and therefore, just because it's been carried out by a German prankster doesn't necessarily rule out that there may be some Russian connection to it, of course. And so it's caused a huge debate over here, but it hasn't caused that much movement. They are looking at changing the rules of engagement. There's another bigger debate in the rest of Europe, of course, about what we're supposed to do about these drone incursions. I wrote a story a couple of weeks ago about mini missiles possibly being the solution to this. Very, very, very cheap, small interceptors that are launched up into the sky in civilian airports and other civilian areas. And instead of having an explosive warhead on the top, it's got what's called a kinetic interceptor, which basically punches the drone out of the sky. There's a big debate about whether those might be the answer. But certainly, Francis, here in Germany, those Munich airport incursions, it almost felt like they were designed to cause maximum disruption. And indeed, they did. An attempt, perhaps, if this was by Russia, to punish its government for its increasingly tough stance on defending Ukraine.
Thank you, James. That's really interesting and I think underreported. Of course, another country that's been suffering even more heavily of these kind of incursions is Poland. And I know that you've been doing a lot of work on that country too. And I'd be keen to hear more about that in your final thoughts in a couple of minutes' time. But before we go to those, I just wanted to end with one more story today, which I think does warrant its own short section. And that is the visit of the new Syrian president, Ahmed al-Sharaa, to Moscow yesterday, one that caught many by surprise, given that the ousted leader Bashar al-Assad was propped up by Moscow and Russian aircraft in the civil war killed thousands. And, of course, the Kremlin greenlit the chemical weapons campaign deployed by Assad's regime against the very forces al-Sharaa commanded. Now, at the meeting, there were warm words exchanged between the two leaders, and it's led to a myriad of diverse interpretations this morning. For some, it's a humiliation for the Syrians, desperate for legitimacy. For others, it's the reverse, a desperate attempt by the Kremlin to keep one of its former countries within its sphere of influence on board after years vilifying the Syrian revolution and its supporters. Now, for those of you who are interested in this subject, by far the best piece I've read on it is by Hannah Knott in Foreign Affairs, which we'll link to in the episode description. She writes how, after the revolution, Russia wasted no time in courting Syria's new rulers. Overnight, Russian TV stopped calling them terrorists. At the UN in January, its diplomats commended Syria's transitional government for acting competently. Since then, however, she writes, Russia has defied expectations, hanging on to its main bases on Syria's coast and entrenching itself in the country's northeast. Russian diplomats moved quickly to engage the new rulers in Damascus, benefiting from Syrians' perception that Russia is a great power and al-Sharaa's desire to build positive relations with all external governments. Syria's new leaders have, in turn, taken a constructive tone with Moscow, hoping for Russian energy, grain, friendly votes at the UN and possibly arms. By engaging Russia, al-Sharaa's government also seeks to deter former Assad loyalists from rearing their heads, to warn Western states that Syria can look elsewhere for support on energy and defence, and perhaps even to limit Israeli military action within its borders. With its veto on the UN Security Council, Russia could help remove the UN terrorist designations, which come with travel bans and asset freezes on al-Sharaa and others close to him. Trained on Soviet and Russian systems, Syria's new army may also hope for Russian weapons, especially because of much of its military capability has been decimated by Israeli strikes over the past year. Knott concludes by writing, many Syrians loathe Moscow for the countless bombs it dropped on Syrian cities in support of Assad. But Syrians never perceived Russia, as they did Iran, as sectarian or bent on changing the very fabric of their society. Russia was seen as cynical, pragmatic, ruthless, with a long history in the Middle East. These perceptions, plus the fact that Mahir al-Sharaa, Ahmed's brother, has family ties to Russia, also help explain why Russia was not chased out of Syria outright. But al-Sharaa has no intention of returning the country into Russia's orbit. In fact, he is maintaining a delicate balance between Russia and its adversaries. In September, Syria restored diplomatic ties with Ukraine. Rather than panicking over Moscow's manoeuvrings or conditioning their own support on Syria's total break with Russia, US and European leaders should focus on helping Syrians recover after a decade of civil war and half a century of despotism. The best way to ensure Syria will not allow Russia to exploit its territory in the future is to build good relations with Damascus today. So, Hannah, not there. We should be cautious to assume Damascus is falling back into Russia's sphere of influence. Damage certainly was done all those months ago with the Kremlin's loss of Assad, but it remains a complicated picture, one we have to continue to monitor. But let's go to our final thoughts now then. Adélie, where do you want to leave listeners today?
Yes, I wanted to focus on a story I don't think we've talked about, which is the death of French photojournalist Anthony Lalican. He was 37 years old and he was killed in an FPV drone attack in Donetsk Oblast on October 3rd. The attack also wounded Ukrainian photojournalist George Ivanchenko, who lost a leg in the attack. And Le Monde has published a beautiful tribute of his photographs and an obituary of his work and the person that he was. It's really shaken the French journalism community. Both him and George Ivanchenko were in Donetsk to document stories of civilians near the front line amid the ongoing Russian push to advance in the area. And they were attacked while stepping out of a dugout about 20 kilometers from the front line, so quite far, actually. I mean, have we been 20 kilometres from the front line when we were in Kharkiv? I think we were within that range.
Yeah, to 20 to 15.
Yeah.
And then Dom got even closer with Jack.
Exactly. So very much not taking any inconsiderate risks. Both of them wore protective gear, clearly labelled press, and the members of the 4th Mechanized Brigade that they were embedded with that said that the drone went straight for them when they came out of the dugout. That makes Anthony the 17th journalist to be killed by Russia since the beginning of the full-scale invasion and the 4th French journalist. It is obviously one more example of how Russia deliberately targets journalists and tries to prevent thorough coverage of the war, not only by targeting individuals with FPV drones, but we've mentioned on this podcast before about the targeting of hotels near the front line that are being targeted by missiles. Truth Hounds, the war crime investigation organization, produced a very elaborate report on that in the spring. The French prosecutor's office has opened an investigation for war crime. I will link to it. I just wanted to mention him, think of him, and think of his family and loved ones.
Thank you very much, Adélie. Just a very brief one from me. We've done a lot on chess recently, including that episode where Dom and I played the Telegraph's chess correspondent Malcolm Payne as he explained Russian and Ukrainian attitudes to the sport, which also featured in our documentary on Odessa, which Russia took issue with and plastered our faces on one of their TV channels. I know many of you enjoyed that. Well, many thanks to listener Peter Heiner Nielsen, who flagged that Ukraine has just won the European Chess Team Championship, with their top scorer, Igor Kovalenko, incredibly being a frontline soldier. How amazing is that? Kudos to them. And I'd love to do something more on that in a future episode. But James, as our guest, where would you like to leave listeners today?
Thank you, Francis. Well, first of all, I've just looked it up and women can indeed join the Diplomatic Sasorna Society. So that's confirmed. And then I'll just briefly sort of flag a story I've been working on at the moment about Poland. It's a story really that's examining the extent to which Poland is getting ready to defend the country, not just in the air from Russia, but also perhaps from the ground. It's, of course, a country that shares a long land border with Russia in the form of the Kaliningrad exclave, and it shares a very tricky border with Belarus, which Lukashenko has been using to send migrants over. I won't give away sort of the full details of the story because it hasn't been published yet, of course, but Telegraph photographer Jeff Pugh and I were driving all over Poland, speaking to various fascinating characters from the full spectrum, really, of civil defence. So not just, for example, instructors who teach at military schools, but also having a chat with members of paramilitary factions as well, and preppers too. So it was really fascinating, and that will be published, I understand, in the very near future.
Ukraine the Latest is an original podcast from The Telegraph, created by David Knowles. To support our work and stay on top of all of our Ukraine news, analysis and dispatches from the ground, please subscribe to The Telegraph. You can get 1 month free, then 2 months for just £1 at www.telegraph.co.uk/Ukraine the Latest. Deploying cutting-edge technology, we also release Ukrainian and Russian versions of this podcast. These translations retain our voices and delivery so that it can reach listeners in every region of Ukraine and those parts of Eastern Europe where Russian is still widely spoken. Links to those can be found in the podcast description to this episode. You can also now sign up to the new Ukraine the Latest weekly newsletter. Each week, Dom Nichols and I answer your questions, provide recommended reading, and give exclusive analysis and behind-the-scenes insights, plus maps of the front lines and diagrams of weapons to complement our daily reporting. It's free for everyone, including non-subscribers. You can find the link to sign up in the descriptions for this episode. We regularly have a Ukraine Live blog on our website, where you can follow updates as they come in throughout the day, including insights from regular contributors to this podcast. We also do the same for other breaking international stories. If you appreciate our work, please consider following Ukraine the Latest on your preferred podcast app and leave us a review, as it really helps others find the show. Please also share it with those who may not be aware we exist. You can listen to this conversation live at 1 p.m. London time each weekday on X Spaces. Follow The Telegraph so that you don't miss it. You can also get in touch directly to ask questions or give comments by emailing ukrainepod@telegraph.co.uk. We continue to read every message. You can also contact us directly on X. You'll find our handles in the description for this episode. As ever, we're especially interested to hear where you're listening from around the world. Ukraine the Latest was today produced by Phil Atkins. Executive producers are Francis Dearnley, Louisa Wells, and David Knowles.
My name is David Knowles. Thank you all for listening. Goodbye.